Welcome everybody to today's digital masterclass. The title of today's masterclass is Core Web Vitals Judgment Day. Not that we're being overly dramatic or anything, but snappy title.
So Google currently uses something called Page Experience as part of its ranking algorithm. Page Experience is focused pretty much or very heavily on mobile friendliness, safe browsing, HTTPS. So it's all about kind of security and trust, that part of the algorithm. Core Web Vitals is an addition to those page signals. So it's new kind of ranking criteria that is this time much more heavily focused around customer experience and how good the experience that you're providing a user when it visits your website. And it's focused on speed, responsiveness, and visual stability. Google's mission is to provide customers with the most relevant answer and the best possible experience, so you keep coming back. So we're trying to put customer experience at the top of their agenda. So it's all about providing a better end result for customers. What's the impact going to be of this update? So people who optimize will see a benefit. If you kind of start aligning your platform, putting your tech in place to make sure that you're ticking these page signals, you will see a benefit. If you don't, then your rankings will decline. And it's all about kind of putting you and your competitors on level apart, and whoever provides the best customer experience will see a positive on their rankings. The fact that, as Paul said, Google give us this notification, they give us the heads up it was coming, kind of alludes to the fact that it is being tracked quite seriously. They know that it is going to have a bit of an impact, and that's why they've given us that heads up. Obviously, we've spoke around the rollout being in May 2021. Whereas Google have kind of came out now and said, actually, we're not going to roll it out till mid-June. And it's not going to be an immediate switch of a button. You wake up one day and you've got a whole lot of change to kind of deal with. It's going to be a phased rollout, hence Paul's analogy of Slowmageddon. It's going to be by the end of August.
People have been doing the tech, they've been doing the on-site content, they've been doing all of the good SEO foundational work. What Google are basically trying to get at now is, if we're going to send users from Google to your website, what's the experience that user is going to have? And if they're having a bad experience, then you probably don't deserve to be at the top of Google.
I kind of noticed that actually my experience as a user is getting better. I'm discovering that websites are slicker, and things are feeling better. And you kind of realize that there was probably quite a lot of things that were wrong with how websites have been built. That actually the benefit is to the user as well as to the business in improving their rankings. Like you said, this is a kind of subset of page experience, and it's these kind of three core areas. So I think Kev was going to just give us a recap on what are these three main things that I'm noticing as when I'm browsing.
Like you say, there's three areas. There's largest contentful paint. To you and me, that basically means loading performance. How long does it take a page to fully load? So that comes down to imagery, the size of the page, etc., etc. Largest contentful paint is a metric, and anything less than sort of 2.5 seconds is classed as good by Google. Anything over 4 seconds is actually classed as poor. The next one of the three is the first input delay. So to you and me, that basically means is how quickly can I actually start using that website? So the moment that you land on the website, you might want to click on the menu. You might want to click on, one of the images on the hero banners or anything like that. How slow is the website allowing that to happen? So you're literally talking anything less than 100 milliseconds is classed as good. Anything more than 300 milliseconds is classed as poor. So that's even quicker that you have to get your website to start doing stuff. And then the final bit is the cumulative layout shift. Cumulative layout shift is the visual stability of the page. Everyone on this call will be aware of newspapers and adverts and pop-ups and pop-unders and the way things shift around. That is primarily one of the things that I think Google are trying to look at, is to make sure that websites perform cleanly and people don't get frustrated trying to use a website. They've kind of looked into that and they've said, right, okay, anything of a scoring metric of 0.1 is or less is good. Anything of 0.25 is poor. Google sent you the traffic. You've used the website. It's quick to load. It's quick to give you the access, quick to give you the information. But can you actually use the website the way that you want to use it? And if you can't, then, that's going to have a negative impact on you.
Yeah, it's amazing how just by addressing those three things, you get a website that loads instantly, you can interact with instantly, and it feels absolutely rock solid while you're doing it. And as a user experience, that's just perfect, isn't it? And And like I was saying, that then when you look at when you experience a website that doesn't do that, you realise what a poor kind of, it feels unprofessional, it feels shoddy, you know, and why Google have kind of put such a degree of you know, importance on these. It really does kind of nail a really core bit of the user experience just by addressing those three areas, doesn't it? And kind of onto the main thing that we wanted to kind of share with you all today, which is kind of what have we discovered? You know, what are the culprits going to be? How do you deal with them? You know, and yeah, so just over to Andy, just kind of give us a bit of a intro into this.
Yeah, so since we kind of last spoke, what we've been doing is we've been working with kind of clients, people who attended some of the masterclasses we've done previously, and we've carried out about 80 investigations / audits across websites. You know, the SEO team have worked closely with Craig's team to first of all identify where we need to target our research and our investigations, looking at the most kind of visited pages on mobile and desktop to kind of have a place to start. And then the development team have basically went into each of these platforms and started giving audits and reports on what can be done to improve it and where you should start, because a lot of this is about kind of investigation and optimization to keep kind of, I suppose, chipping away at it, you know, looking at, and every website is different that we've done it on.
A big reoccurring factor that we saw in the impact of LCP was large and unoptimized images. So we're talking about images there which are large in regards to file size, so they'll add to the overall network payload, and it'll take a while for your browser to retrieve that and handle it. But also, images not really being optimized for mobile as well. So, you know, like a couple of thousand pixel images with that height being uploaded and being rendered on mobile, and they're not being desktop and sort of mobile specific versions of that. What we started recommending to our clients where we identified that was sort of simply that they don't upload images that are unoptimized. So there's a really quick fix for this essentially, and there's websites out there like TinyPNG, like compressor.io, where you can actually upload your images before you put them on your site. And what it'll do is it'll use something called lossy compression that really simply rearranges the images to get rid of unnecessary data, keeps the quality, keeps the image looking exactly like it should be, but it'll bring the file size down. So our first suggestion really was for people to start doing that. And that's a short-term solution, to be honest, because what we find is that this is sort of an ongoing battle between people who publish content and site developers who are trying to optimize. Longer term, it's probably worth engaging with your development partner or whoever looks after your website to see if it's possible to do that at the time of upload. There are things that you can put in your platform to actually compress on the fly, and it will take things longer to upload, but then at least the end user will get something sort of more optimized there at the end. And the last thing to sort of add on to that, and it's a reoccurring theme throughout this chat, to be honest, is apply a really aggressive caching policy as well on top of that, because you'll find these are static resources. You'll upload that image and it probably won't change. So cache that for a very long time. And then hopefully you'll see an improvement in regards to LCP in regards to that. What I would say is large and unoptimized images aren't the be-all and end-all of LCP. So a site that still seems to suffer from a poor LCP score is Google's actual storefront for selling their devices, like all of the Google Home devices. So they actually fail. And we've identified that the LCP is actually just the Google Home product image, which is actually really small in size. It's only like 640 by 640 pixels. So they've done everything that we would have recommended. But the problem is it draws very late on the page. So LCP is that measurement of how long it takes for the largest thing on that page to appear. And Google's got an optimized image, but it takes over 2.5 seconds to draw. So they're actually failing their own metric. So a very quick fix, and the thing that we saw quite often is upload optimized images. But like I say, it's not the guaranteed fix for this problem. LCP is all about getting that largest bit of content on the page as fast as possible.
Is there anything in exploring are there any new and emerging formats and compression formats that people should be aware of? Yeah,
there are. So again, that was a sort of a recommendation that we come up with quite often, but it's one that Google builds into their Lighthouse reports and PageSpeed Insight, but serving next-gen image formats. Modern browsers now support them, and a common one that Google is pushing because they are related to this image format is WebP. So if you can actually get your browser to, rather than serve image files which are JPEGs or PNGs, to serve WebP, they will sort of be optimized out of the box, essentially. The thing to keep in mind there is if you do swap the WebP, they don't really work well with background images. And if you do want to keep support for like IE11, you need to have a fallback. So HTML5 has a picture element, and you can specify if a browser supports WebP, use this version. If it supports JPEG, use this version. But all of the tools they use to measure LCP will support WebP and stuff like that. So if you can make that internal investment, it's definitely worth it.
The second big thing, and this I suppose at first when we started having conversations around this made me shudder a little bit. But so font usage, they get this idea of kind of our designers putting lots of effort into choosing beautiful typography, using weights correctly, and then you come along and tell me, we've got to look at the kind of fonts you're using on the website, guys.
Yeah, so again, a common thing that we saw was sort of fonts embedded from third-party resources like Typekit, like Google Fonts, and things like that. And we're not sort of necessarily saying don't use fonts which match your brand or feed in nicely to the overall theme of your website, but probably just take a look at how they are being used. So, Google, again, highlighted some of this to us on client websites where, they weren't being cached and things like that. So if you can host fonts yourself, include them in a place where you can, again, apply a heavy caching policy to that, which will help reoccurring visitors to the site. But we also found examples where we were using things like Typekit, and we were using a certain version of a font, but including probably 7 or 8 different versions of that font, and it was for all of the different weight classes, and then also the italicized versions of that font. So we actually reviewed the client site, and we saw actually from what was being used there was only one weight that was being used. So our recommendation was actually to remove all of those other references. The whole font library was included, and it wasn't necessary. So again, that brought the network payload down, which meant that the page was going to render faster. And then also in regards to the italicized version, we just used the browser's sort of full ability to render italics, and it looked okay on those fonts. So we made those recommendations for those to be changed. But yeah, again, it's not about not using fonts, but it's about just optimizing it to make sure that you bring that network sort of payload down and get it rendering as fast as possible. There's a lot of also different techniques. Font usage can play an impact on CLS. So we actually saw an example here where somebody's cookie policy would pop up at the bottom of the page, and then the font would render in, and that caused layout shift because you had a paragraph there warning people about the cookie policy, and then it would change its height based on that, swapping to that font. So what you should look at is techniques for like pre-connecting to that domain to go off to tell the browser to prioritize that font file, using font swap techniques so there isn't a flashy text, and just optimize how they're used on your site. It's not about not using them, it's just about finding that balance to make sure that you're not including too much and that you're using them correctly.
The third point that we were going to touch on was third-party scripts. So a lot of the conversation that I suppose what we've always said from this, it's all about kind of compromise and optimizing to get it where it needs to be. And I think third-party scripts are the biggest area, the biggest kind of point on all of our reports where this could be where you compromise, where you look at the priority of some of the things or tools you're using as a business. And this might be something that you just can't change if it's critical to the business. And what we mean by this is if you're using a third-party live chat, if you're integrating with your CRM tool, using something like Zendesk to handle customer support. So anything that you're using that sits outside of your control, obviously you're limited with what you can do with it. So third-party scripts caused us a problem in some areas, didn't it, Craig?
Yeah, it did. And mainly the main area that we focused on was any third-party script that was actually going to be render blocking. So render blocking is the idea that your browser will stop doing what it needs to do until it's received that file and handled it, because it's determined that it's critical. And anything that's render blocking means that the end user is going to receive that white screen for a little bit longer, essentially. So we saw a lot of third-party vendor scripts that were causing that. And we highlighted those to the clients and just sort of said, audit the use of these and actually find out if they are required or the sort of more lightweight versions. It's a really tricky problem, this one, not just for people who build websites, but also for third-party vendors, because they're going to start getting a lot of heat now from people. And probably rightly so, because they've always been able to just produce something, and it might provide the best user experience in the world, but it's not optimized from a dev perspective, and they'll just ask people to put it on the website. But yeah, anything that's render blocking is essentially really bad. We started looking at things like, Hotjar. Hotjar is a fantastic tool, the data it can give you, but do you need it to run on every page? Probably not. Can you set it to run on certain schedules and things like that? Live chat was an example. Rather than actually including the live chat scripts there on page on the first initial load, we try to delay that. So the first initial paint happened, and then we just replaced the live chat with sort of an icon. And when that icon was clicked, then it initiated the live chat. So things like that will help you optimize and still retain the third-party functionality that you might need. It might help your clients sort of convert and things like that. But it's a bit of a balancing act. You can use a lot of the techniques that have been introduced, like telling your browser to pre-connect, which I mentioned earlier. So telling it to try and prioritize fetching those resources. But anything that's sort of render blocking, you need to take a look at sort of urgently and see if there's a way to sort of get around that. So layout shift is a tricky one because it's Google gives you so little to play with in regards to how they measure what's poor and what needs improvement and what's good, as Kev mentioned earlier. So we saw some examples of sort of layout shift when fonts were drawn in, which we've already talked about. We also saw some examples where images would drop onto the page. So we had product pages where the page would do the initial paint, the title of the product would appear, and then the image would appear, which would push content down. And Google hated that from a layout shift perspective. And we also saw things like where people had advertising space. So some of these sites, ads are really sort of a big revenue driver for these people, and they had ads in a couple of different places. But what would happen is that ad would drop in and then push all of the content down, and straight away that was a fail from a layout shift perspective. This isn't sort of an initiative from Google to say don't use ads, obviously, because from a paid perspective, it's a big part of their model. But what you can do is sort of reserve space for this content that might take a bit longer to drop in. There's a technique called sort of like skeleton layout or skeleton themes, where the idea is, and you've probably experienced it when you've gone on a new site and the banner will appear and you'll just see a lot of space reserved for content that will slowly drop in. So to fix layout shift and move on to things like that, it's about just reserving space. We've had a lot of clients have like COVID banners because of the pandemic. Reserve the space for that rather than have it push the content down the page. So infrastructure is a really simple one, to be honest, and it's about just making sure that you've got the system there to handle the load of your website and the amount of traffic that you get to your website. You will struggle across all of these metrics, to be honest, if you're on a hosted platform that doesn't meet your business needs. There were two ways that we measured that. So there's a metric called time to first byte, which isn't a core web vital metric, but it's a very easy way. What it essentially does is you fire off a request to the server, and as soon as it responds, that's your measure of time to first byte. And if that takes a very long time, that's, again, another white screen that somebody's got to look at. And then we also looked at the use of HTTP2. So HTTP2 essentially allows your browser a much easier way of gathering resources using, it can request multiple resources through a single connection, which frees up essentially resource on the server in a really simplistic point of view. So we reiterated to just a lot of people, just have a check of your hosted platform and make sure it matches your need. Because if that type of first byte is massive, we're probably going to struggle to fix LCP. So this one, to be honest, we're talking about last because it's probably the most difficult to implement. And deferring non-critical CSS and JavaScript basically is the idea of you've got above the fold content and below the fold. You want to prioritize the CSS and JavaScript that is related to that above the fold content. And you want that to load, and you want that to be fast, and you want it to do the first initial paint and then defer the rest of that. It can be tricky to do because as developers, we've been sort of conditioned to build everything and then compile it into minified CSS as one file and then drop it on there. But it's about separating and making sure you've only got the CSS and JavaScript that page specifically needs to load in fast. And that'll help across all metrics, essentially.
You're covering a lot of different aspects of your website, and but the good news is that being systematic and working your way through it, you can get some of these things ironed out. I think since we've all become aware of the term core web vitals, the first question is, how do I measure it? And certainly for me, as we've gone through this little journey of core web vitals, I've become aware of lots of different tools. And when do you use which one? Which ones are good for devs? Which one should you show the CEO? So Kev's just going to give us a few tips on that.
The first one that we always recommend is using Google's own Pagespeed Insights tool. You literally plug your URL in, whether that's your homepage, your category, your product page, And it will literally tell you what's wrong with the page in terms of core web vitals. Is the LCP wrong? Is the CLS wrong, et cetera, et cetera. So all those metrics that I mentioned at the beginning, it will give you the score of how that page actually performs. If you want to look at your site as a whole, you should be using Google Search Console. It will basically give you the data in Search Console, but it will give it to you in a site-wide perspective. You can actually use the Chrome Dev Tools, which is actually in Chrome as well, and that will give you a score based on what your experience as you're using that page. So all the refinements, all the testing you can do locally effectively.
So Google have expanded Chrome as well. So under the Performance tab now, there's a Core Web Vitals option, and it will actually tell you what is your LCP when it draws. It'll alert you to any bits of layout shift and stuff. And they also have a powerful option under the Rendering tab, which will highlight in blue any layout shift that happens when a page loads. So as devs, it's a really quick way of trying to identify problems and find the faults, but it's real time. It doesn't give you that whole field data view that Kev talked about, which Pagespeed Insights would.
Google's own resource on it as well is web.dev. That's actually their URL, web.dev. And that has everything that you'll need from a development perspective from Google as well.
One of the key takeouts there is it's kind of different tools for different teams, and what your focus is going to be. But I think the thing that really stands out for me is which of these are kind of live data and which of these are kind of kind of cumulative data that might be over a week, over a month. And I think we've certainly had situations where you've kind of looked at someone's core web vitals and they've passed 1 week and then they've not passed the other week, and it's because of the tools are kind of reporting slightly differently.
Google talks about web vitals and core web vitals. So this is just the start, really, and it does feel like they're going to continue to focus on that page experience for end users. So it's worth making that investment now to do that, and then definitely routinely check in to make sure that you always do that, because if you're on sort of a level playing field with maybe a competitor, this is the thing that could give you an edge, or could give them an edge if you don't keep it optimized.
But the tech SEO stuff that we're talking about today is purely about how do you make absolutely the best website with the best experience. So never put the SEOs in the corner and say there's some kind of esoteric part of marketing. If your website's a core part of your business, then your SEO guys and your web dev guys are critical. There's probably a million other things we could have talked about and explored, but there you go, we've run out of time. Tune in next week for another exciting Mediaworks Digital Masterclass. So thank you very much and goodbye.